Hello, everyone. Today, I have prepared some scary stories for you. Sit back and enjoy watching. I was in a bus crash with 5 other passengers. After the crash, there were 6. All it took was a patch of black ice to send our Blue Star bus careening into a tree. I'd been trying to sleep, but between the guy snoring behind me, the jostling bumps, and the driver's radio, it wasn't gonna happen. 12 inches of snow, expected manhunt continues for Sterling inmate hears the traffic report. See a UNCH. My head smacked into the window. Then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was aware of only 2 things, the throbbing in my head and the cold. My entire body was freezing, like I'd fallen asleep outside. Where am I? Oh no. I pushed myself up. Oh, you're awake. Thank God. Harry rushed to my side, wrapping his arms around me. Are you okay? How's your head? It hurts, I groan. Is everyone okay? Yeah. I mean, we're all scratched up and stuff, but no one's seriously hurt. I glanced around the bus. There was a teenage girl with blood running down her face, crying in her boyfriend's arms. An older lady who'd clearly had too many lip fillers, staring out the window with a glassy look. A white dude scrolling on his phone as if nothing happened, and a muscular bearded guy with a Jason Momoa vibe near the front. Did somebody call? Yeah, but it's going to be hours, he said with a sigh. The storm's gotten worse. They have to come up the mountain in a snowcat. What time is it? A little before 3. I pulled my coat on, zipping it up to my neck until it wouldn't go anymore. It's so cold. I had no idea how I was going to be able to stay here like this, head throbbing, body shivering for hours. I looked out the windshield. The front of the bus was crumpled beyond recognition. It was a miracle the driver lived. And beyond the bus, the sky was deep gray, heavy with snow, as snowflakes steadily fell against the dark trees. Everyone, we have a problem, the driver called from the front. No shit, we have a problem, the bearded guy snapped. We're stranded here, with no food or water, in the middle of a blizzard. All because you weren't paying attention. Hey, shut it. We all make mistakes. No one got hurt, Harry said next to me. Speak for yourself, the lip filler woman replied, rubbing her temple. I think I have a concussion. We're going to die out here, the teenage girl wailed. Quiet, the driver screamed, and there was something in his voice, a note of panic that set us all absolutely silent. Now, you listen to me very carefully, he said in a low voice, barely above a whisper. I drive this route all the time, and I know the woods around here are dangerous. It's just woods for miles and miles, and people see that as an opportunity. Hikers go missing. There's cult activity. I've seen it with my own 2 eyes, people throwing branches across the road to make you stop, but they're hiding in the bushes to ambush you. He paused, swallowed, and rubbed his hands together. And I think we have, found ourselves in one of those types of situations. What are you talking about? I stuttered. The driver got out of his seat and walked towards the bus door, shards of windshield snapping under his feet. Slowly, one by one, the 7 of us got out of our seats. The doors were open, ice-cold wind whipping inside. For fuck's sake! That's why it's so cold in here. I opened my mouth to yell at the driver to close the door. And then I saw it. Footprints in the snow. A single trail of them, leading from the darkness of the woods to the bus doors. Someone got on this bus after we crashed. Must have snuck in right after. when most of us were knocked out or trying to get our wounds fixed up. The driver lowered his voice to a whisper. Someone is on the bus, right now. I don't know if they're hiding under the seats somewhere, or in the bathroom, or what. And I don't know what we should do. If we go into the woods, there might be more of them. But if we stay here, we might all die. His stern expression faded, and he sucked in a shuddering breath. Gah, I've got a little 3-year-old at home. I can't. He leaned against the crushed steering wheel, head in his hands. The 7 of us looked at each other. I squeezed Harry's hand, my heart pounding in my chest. They probably just want our money. We'll hand over our wallets, and then the police will be here. This was supposed to be our second chance. One last shot at fixing our marriage, at finding what we'd lost. Now it felt like fate was laughing at us. No way in hell you're getting a second chance. Lock the doors. It's 8 against 1, the angry bearded guy said, breaking the silence. We can take him. What if he's got a gun, smartass? The lip filler woman shot back. Kind of sexist to assume it's a guy, the phone dude said. I don't want to die, the teenage girl sobbed. Wait, he said. He looked up at us, his eyes wide in the darkness. Oh, no. What is it? I asked, a weight sinking in my chest. I only scanned 6 tickets. 1, 2, 3, he mouthed as he counted us again. There are 7 of you. But only 6. His face grew even paler. Oh, God, it's one of you. What the fuck? I looked at the other passengers, my heart pounding. But as my eyes settled on each of their faces, I honestly couldn't tell you whether they'd been riding with us or not. Teenage couple, lip filler woman, bearded guy, phone dude. I'd been trying to sleep most of the trip, and so had everybody else, I think. The interior lights had been off, and the bus was pretty dark. The bearded guy straightened, towering over us. So, who is it then? We'll play nice. Give you our wallets and everything. Just don't hurt us, and this will all play out smooth. Silence. I think it's that guy, the lip filler woman said, pointing to the guy glued to his phone. He doesn't look hurt. Dude? Seriously? He looked up at us, and I could tell he was young, no more than 25. My thumb is fucked up. I can barely text. The teenage girl locked eyes with me. Then she lifted a shaking finger and pointed it right at me. You. What? You think I'm it? No. I mean, I remember you. Her young, pretty features tightened into a scowl. You were really rude. You literally threw your bag on top of mine. I have designer boots in here, and they might be crushed because you don't care about other people. And you probably don't even care if I die out here and...
Stop! Harry shouted.
That's good that you remember her. That's a fact that we can use. Does anyone else remember anyone else? He was snoring behind me, the teenage boyfriend said, pointing at the bearded guy. It was really annoying. Anyone else? Silence. Wait, hang on. We can look everyone up on Facebook, can't we? Verify their identity? I asked. I pulled out my phone and my heart dropped. Shit. No service. It's a miracle we got a call through the cops at all, the lip filler woman said. I looked at the 6 other passengers. Harry's my husband, so he's out. The teenage couple, they vouch for each other, don't they? Assuming the person isn't some memory-altering demon out of a horror movie. That left phone dude, bearded guy, and lip filler woman. 3 people. One of them lying. It was true that despite phone dude's protests, he was the least hurt of the 3. He looked young and innocent, but you can't judge a book by its cover. I looked at lip-filler woman. Her face was weird. That was the only way to describe it. I'd assumed it was the plastic surgery, but maybe not. There was something off about her whole eye area, and her face remained mostly expressionless this entire time. Was it lots of Botox? Or could she be wearing a mask? I stared at her neck, looking for a seam. But in the dim lighting, I couldn't make anything out. Then there was Bearded Guy. He was intimidating, and he seemed like a ball of angry energy, ready to explode at any time. The blood on his sleeve didn't mean anything. There was blood everywhere. He could have just wiped some on to make it look good. He seemed like the obvious choice, but then again, the teenager vouched for him. Maybe we should just go into the woods, I whispered to Harry. Get away from everyone. You heard the driver. He said there might be more of them out there, but staying in here. It's 7 against 1. But why aren't they doing anything yet? If they just wanted to rob us, they would have done it by now. I shuddered. It's like they're playing with us. You can go out alone if you want, but I'm staying here. I'm not going to. Well, I'm not going to die because of your stupidity. There it was. The temper that had grown with each passing year of our marriage. I wanted to yell and scream at him, but I already knew that never worked. Instead, I stared at the windshield, blinking away tears. Small flakes flurried down, collecting in at the bottom of the windshield. Beyond was the stretch of road carving up the mountain, now pure white. The set of footprints leading out the door, their edges softened by the layer of fresh snow. And something else. A lump, just off the side of the road, at the border of the woods. Something about it caught my eye even though, in the darkness and the snow, I couldn't make out any detail. It was like it didn't belong, like it clashed with the natural landscape. And was that a trail of footprints leading up to it? I narrowed my eyes, trying to parse what I was seeing. Had someone already left the bus, gone out and come back? Was one of the passengers in on this whole thing? And was that blood in the snow? Guys, look. I pointed out the windshield. My head throbbed as my heart began to pound, and I felt lightheaded. Out there's a trail of blood and something. The voices died down behind me. Oh my God, the teenage girl whispered. Other mutters too. What is that? Is that blood? Black spots danced in my eyes. I grabbed the driver's seat to keep my balance. It was wet. I pulled my hand away to see thick, red blood staining my fingers. What? I looked down. The driver's seat was drenched in blood. But the driver, his clothes were dry. No, it's the driver. I screamed, backing away. It's him. At first, he didn't say anything. Then he slowly turned around, and when I saw his face, my blood ran cold. He was smiling. Chaos erupted. I lunged for the door, but as soon as I stepped down, something yanked my arm back. My entire body jolted, my head screaming in pain. I whipped around to see the man, his fingers gripping me tight. Not so fast, he growled, his grin growing wider. But then, in a blur of color, Harry slugged him in the face. His grip loosened and I tumbled to the ground. Snow seared my skin, the ice cold burning my fingers, seeping through my pants. Quickly, the others raced out. The teenage couple, the woman, one of the guys. The bearded man joined Harry in trying to subdue the guy, trying to tackle him to the ground. "Run!" Harry shouted, locking eyes with me. "Run!" After a moment's hesitation, I ran. The others followed, and we all ran deeper into the forest, terrified. We kept the road in our sight, and after a few hours of wandering, we spotted the lights of the snowcat coming up the mountain. As we ran, though, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd heard on the radio. While I'd been trying to sleep, "Manhunt continues for Sterling inmate." Was that him? By the time the police arrived, all 3 men were gone. They haven't been found. I'd like to think they're alive somewhere. That, in a few days, Harry will come home. But I know, deep down, that's not the case. The police did find the body of our real driver, though. At the end of the bloody footprints in the snow. Let's move on to the next story. I've been homeless for the last 16 years. This is why. I live on the streets. When they meet me, people wonder why. I've made up all sorts of lies and occasionally told the truth. Even rarer, somebody believes me. I finally decided to set it down in writing, to record it for after I pass on, and so that I don't have to repeat the story. Next time somebody asks, they can simply read this. Most people just walk past a homeless person. Some will give spare change. That's rarer these days, with fewer people carrying cash. But there are enough kind people willing to go into shops for me that I get by. Barely, and even more rarely, somebody will stop to talk to me. Most homeless people I know don't ask. We've all experienced trauma of some kind, and we generally don't like to talk about it. My story is unusual, though. I'm very articulate, and I'm fluent in English, French, Mandarin, German, and Yoruba, with a decent understanding of Swedish, Korean, and Swahili. I'm also very good at talking my way out of situations and persuading people to find common ground. With all these skills, people who talk to me ask, why aren't I, for example, a well-paid translator or diplomat? The answer is simple. Because those jobs take place indoors. For the last 7 years, I've lived on the streets of a city in West Africa. I won't name it. I get by on the charity of others and doing gardening jobs, and a bit of brick laying in the early stages of construction, at least. I have to bail on those jobs when houses are nearing completion, as you'll see. But I grew up in northern England. My parents are, fairly wealthy, and I attended a private school. Not one you'll likely have heard of, but my education was excellent. My life was going very well. I had plenty of friends, and I was getting good grades in science, French, and Latin. I had won a few minor piano competitions, and enjoyed skiing holidays in Switzerland most years. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm boasting. That's not my intention. I'm just presenting my life as it was, so that you fully appreciate the contrast, and so that you understand I had no reason to run from it. You see, just after my 13th birthday, after school on a Friday in June, I was supposed to meet some friends in a coffee shop in town. I was there first, and feeling very grown up and wanting to show off when they arrived, I ordered a latte. So there I was, sitting alone with my coffee, scrolling through Twitter when a woman approached me. She was 40, maybe 50 years old, with long dark hair, and wore what looked like it would have been a very nice business suit 10 years earlier. Now it was ragged, with holes and dark stains. She sat herself down opposite me and stared at me. I tried to ignore her at first. After a minute or so, I looked up and, with an annoyed tone, asked, "Yeah? What do you want?" Her response was just 3 words. "I'm so sorry." And then she reached over and touched my hand, stood up, and walked away. I'd never seen her before, and I haven't seen her again since. Now this, of course, puzzled me. She probably had me confused with somebody else, I told myself. It was a weird encounter, sure, but it was over, and it was at least a good story to tell my friends. Whenever they turned up, I was probably a bit more rattled than I admitted to myself, and I had another sip of my coffee and stood up to go to the toilet. 10 meters walk to the toilet, and that was the last time I was ever in England. I pushed open the toilet door, walked through, and was hit in the face by freezing snow. I don't know where I was back then. In shock, I turned around to go back through the door, but there was no door there. Instead, I was in a field of white. It took me a moment to realize that it was a snowstorm and that I was outside. I don't think I panicked. I didn't understand what had happened or how, but I calmly assessed the situation. I was outside, in the cold and the snow, wearing my summer school uniform shorts, and all with no idea where the nearest shelter was. I could figure out what had happened later. For now, I needed to survive. Looking around, visibility was not as bad as I'd feared. It was daytime. The snow was falling straight down, rather than the storm I'd assumed at first, and I could make out a neat line of trees in the distance. That probably meant a road, and a road meant civilization. So off I headed, across what seemed to be a farmer's field, and in 5 minutes I was indeed on a road. There were no signs that I could make out, so I picked a direction at random and started walking. After about half an hour, I saw a light in the distance. I'd been shivering for some time, but I felt alert, so didn't think I was at immediate risk of hypothermia. I kept going, and soon arrived at a small cottage with lights on in the downstairs windows. A man answered my earnest knocks on the front door. He spoke a few words in a language I didn't know, and I pushed into the house, wanting to get in from the cold before explaining myself. And then I was on a beach. It took a moment to get over the shock of the sweltering heat. I blinked in the bright midday sun and looked around as my eyes started to adjust. I heard the sounds of people splashing in the water and generally having fun. Tout va bien? Tout va bien? A dark-skinned man in shorts and t-shirt was running towards me, asking if I was okay. I suppose I looked quite bewildered and out of place, and was probably the only person nearby still shivering. Still confused, but relieved that he spoke French, a language I understood fairly well. I looked at him and tried to explain what was happening. But truthfully, I didn't know what was happening, and I just stared at him dumbstruck. He introduced himself as Louis. I managed to stammer out a "Where am I?" To which he replied that I was on a beach near Port-au-Prince. With me still barely able to articulate myself, Louis offered his help. He asked where my parents were, and when I couldn't answer, he led me to his car, saying that he could drive me to his house and we could figure things out from there. I've since learned that this was a very unwise move. Port-au-Prince, in Haiti, is one of the most crime-ridden cities on the planet. Murders and kidnappings are common, and there is a good chance Louis intended to traffic me, but I didn't realize that at the time, and I certainly wasn't thinking straight. I followed Louis up the beach, where he led me to a small car and opened the passenger door for me. I climbed into the car and fell quite hard onto the tarmac of a town in the early evening. Now bear in mind that I was 13 years old at the time. In the span of about 2 hours, I'd been accosted by a strange woman, trekked through snow in my shorts, led up a sweltering beach by a stranger, and to top it off, I now had a severely bruised behind. So I think my response to these events was entirely reasonable, given the circumstances. I cried. I looked around, found an out-of-the-way alleyway, hid myself behind some bins, and cried myself to sleep. Somebody woke me by talking loudly. I opened my eyes to see 2 police, a white man and white woman, standing over me. I knew German only enough to identify the language, not to understand what they were saying. But as I stood up in the chill of the early morning, I suppose they saw my school uniform, and the woman started speaking English. Apparently somebody had seen me there, a child sleeping rough, and called the police. The policewoman was very kind. She asked a lot of questions. Had I lost my school tour group? Where was I staying? Did I know my parents' phone number? I mumbled half answers to her questions, and her colleague motioned behind them to the police car I now saw at the end of the alleyway. It was only now that I realized what was happening. Doors were cursed, for me at least. If I tried to get into the police car, who knows where I would end up? For a split second I considered trying to explain things to them before settling on again the only reasonable course of action. It's hard to run from the police, especially when they know the city and you don't. But I was still quite small, and I got lucky. I ran down the alley, turned left into a smaller alley, and saw a chain-link fence a short distance along. A hole had been torn through the bottom, probably by somebody doing something just like me, and I dived down and crawled through. My school blazer caught on the fence, and I struggled to escape. The police had almost caught me by the time I managed to wriggle out of it, and I ran off, leaving my blazer behind. Good riddance, I thought. It made me far too identifiable anyway. I ran for maybe half an hour, ripping my tie off. Now just dressed in gray shorts and white shirt, I looked a bit less like an English schoolboy. It was Saturday, and I was just another German kid out looking for his friends. Germans don't go to school on Saturday mornings, right? I wondered. Whatever the case, I didn't find any more trouble that morning. I still had £30 for coffee and shopping, and I followed the crowd until I found a small street market. One stall owner was happy to take my £30 for a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and a plain jumper, and gave me €10 to buy a small lunch. I'm sure I was ripped off, but didn't really feel I had much choice. To answer the police's question, no, I didn't know my parents' numbers, and my phone was out of charge anyway. I needed a plan. I walked around town, which I learned was called Passau. I decided to stay here, at least this evening. It was still early, but I was exhausted and just needed to rest after the insanity of only, I realized, 24 hours. It was getting dark when I was aroused from dozing. I was sat against a wall in a 90-degree corner when somebody found me. After a similar exchange to the one I'd had that morning, he spoke in broken English. Victor was 16 and had been on the streets of Passau for about a month. His mum had left years before, and his dad had kicked him out of his home when he found out Victor was gay. I hadn't realized that sort of thing still happened. I suppose I had until that day lived a part in the pun-sheltered life. Victor was bigger than me and knew the city. He hadn't lived on the streets that long, but he was far more streetwise than I was, and he showed me how to survive. Over the next few months, I learned where to steal food, where to beg, where the driest shelters were, and even how to pickpocket. Passau has a small homeless community, but a close one, and I got to know some people very well. It's fair to say by the time my 14th birthday rolled around, I was much more aware and capable. I learned German and practiced my French with a fellow migrant. I learned how to repair clothes and how to haggle with street vendors. I was still small for my age and found that I could wriggle into and hide in very tight spaces. In short, I proved myself to be useful to the homeless community of Passau. Useful enough that others were very happy to indulge my little eccentricities and would go into shops for me when I needed to buy something. I got blankets and a sleeping bag for winter, and Victor would even charge my phone for me in coffee shops and pubs. It wasn't the life I was used to, but it was a life, and I had companionship. This all changed after I'd been in Germany just over a year. It was early evening, about an hour before kickoff at the European Championship final. Germany was about to play Spain, and there were plenty of people in the pubs getting drunk. Easy pickings for a thief. Victor and I had been working together for a year, and we carried out our well-rehearsed routine. We hung around a busy street until I saw two men come out of a pub, one of them putting his wallet in his back pocket as he left. Perfect. I signaled to Victor and started walking behind them. After a few moments, Victor bumped into him from the side, giving me the opportunity to lift his wallet. But his friend had turned his head to look behind him at just the wrong moment. He shouted, and the two of them turned to me. I ran, and Victor ran the other way, but the two men ignored him. I had a head start and thought I could outrun them, but one was gaining on me. In a split second, I decided that it would be easier to hide in a crowd, and ran for the door of the packed pub the two men had just left. I pushed the door open and hurtled through it. I arrived in Nanjing at night. Of course, I didn't know this at the time, but it was a fairly busy street, and I saw the Chinese characters on street signs. I won't go into a blow-by-blow account of my time there, which lasted about a year and a half, but in many respects it was similar to my time in Germany. In a way, I was getting used to this. Living on the streets is more or less the same in any country. Nanjing is a much larger city than Paso, and quite prosperous, but every city has its down and outs. I sought out the homeless, and while it took me a while longer than in Germany, I learned the language and culture of the place. If you Google it, you might think Nanjing is pretty safe. For the most part, that's true, but sleeping on the street is no safer there than anywhere else. I found safety in a street gang, putting the skills I'd learned in petty theft and pickpocketing to use. People come and go on the streets, but I ran with a group of 5 or 6 younger people while I was there, even having a bit of a thing with Yihan, a girl a couple of years older than me. We would do what we called hit and run. We'd all accost somebody out alone, steal their wallet, and run in different directions. The others met up in an abandoned warehouse some way out from the center of town, and they got used to my weird insistence on staying outside and sleeping elsewhere. Nanjing has a heavier police presence than Paso, but my colleagues knew where they didn't go, and I did quite well, until one night in March. We were stalking a couple of drunk men in their 30s, and were about to make our practiced move when another group arrived to do the same. I saw the situation developing and signaled my people to move out. Our competitors followed us down a side street. They clearly wanted a fight, and 2 of my friends did as well. I was happy to call it a night, and managed to talk them down from a confrontation, when Yai Chen, who was always a bit trigger-happy, threw a punch at one of the others. 3 of them pulled knives from their coats. One stabbed Yai Chen in the gut, and the others went for the rest of us. I ran. I was the fastest in our gang, but one of them was faster than me, and he nearly caught me. Seeing no other option, I legged it towards the main street and made my way to a shop. The staff were just closing up, but I didn't need to get in there. I just needed to pass the threshold. I made it through the door. This time, I landed in Sweden, in the middle of the countryside. It was early afternoon and sunny, so I walked until I found a road and followed signs to Gothenburg. That was 15 kilometers, and a few drivers offered me a lift along the way, though obviously I declined. I was, in a way, starting to feel quite confident now. I'd relocated twice, and felt that I knew what to do. Sweden is a nice place, even for the homeless, especially if you're young and white. Strangers were generally kind, and I did well there. However, it can get very cold on the streets in winter, and when snow started to fall, I realized I wasn't likely to survive until spring. So, in November, for the first time, voluntarily, I walked through a shop door and into another country. It didn't help. From the mild first snow of a Swedish winter, I arrived in a forest in freezing temperatures. I'd gone from mid-afternoon in Sweden to evening, so I guessed I was somewhere in Russia, but I couldn't stay. After looking around for a bit, I couldn't find any sign of civilization, so I decided to test my curse. Did that woman, 3 years earlier, curse me? She had seemed strange, but not unkind. Perhaps she simply realized, before I did, that I'd been cursed by someone or something else. I didn't know, not back then, but I knew a bit about how it worked. I collected some fallen logs and branches, and over about an hour I built a rectangular frame, a doorway. I stepped through. Nothing happened. I arrived on the other side of the doorway. Okay, so that didn't work. Maybe it needed an actual door. I could hardly build hinges in the forest, even if I knew how. So instead, I gathered some vines and leaves and strung them into a hanging door from the top of the frame, like a beaded curtain. Honestly, I was quite proud of my handiwork. For a first attempt, with no tools, I was very impressed and almost reluctant to test it. But it was cold and dark and starting to rain, so I stepped through it. It worked, and my next stop was Kenya. I found myself in the countryside, on a warm evening, on a farm. I judged that it was a long way to a city, and learned later that I was correct. So I decided to introduce myself to the farmers. They spoke barely any English, and I didn't yet speak any Swahili, but I managed to persuade the family that ran the farm to let me work for them. I'm sure they didn't really understand my motivations. A posh white English boy, asking only for food in exchange for his labor, choosing to sleep outside, but they were friendly and happy with the arrangement. Over the next 2 years, I learned how the farm worked, built up my muscles, and still small and wiry, but strong, and proved myself to be an able worker. I picked coffee beans, milked cows, fixed fences, and acquired a decent tan. I even occasionally made the journey to a nearby market town, sitting in the back of one of the flatbed trucks. I was certainly a curiosity to the locals, but I was treated well. I would happily have stayed on that Kenyan farm for life. But after 2 years, something happened. The father of the household was off at the market town, and the rest of us were working the field. I was bringing several baskets of coffee beans to the barn, and I heard shouting. Mayada, Aseada. Help, help. The mother of the household, Anissa, had fallen in the kitchen. From outside, I could tell that her leg was bad. It was bleeding severely, and I think I could see bones sticking out. It was rare that there was just one person in the farmhouse, but it did happen. The closest help was probably at least 10 minutes away, and Anissa was bleeding too fast. I was the only one who could help, but I needed to get in there, somehow. Obviously, the door was out of the question, but the kitchen window was wide open. Were windows safe? The answer, it turned out, was no. I hope Anissa got the help she needed, though I doubt it. But the last I saw of her, as I swung a leg into the kitchen, was an expression of abject terror. And then she and the farmhouse disappeared, replaced in an instant with the nighttime streets of Seoul. Again, I had to start over, and again, I had to learn a new language. English isn't well spoken in Korea, and it took me some time before I could get on. I made few friends, and supported myself largely by stealing and pickpocketing. Without the kind of network I'd built up in Germany and China, things were more difficult. I got caught a few times and escaped before anything serious happened until after about a year. I guess that the police had had a few reports of street thefts in my area. I noticed an increased police presence, and one day I just got sloppy. A couple were having coffee outside a cafe at lunchtime. The man's wallet was on the table between them, and I was hungry. I pulled my hoodie over my face, ran, and grabbed the wallet. While I was running away, I pulled the cash out, throwing the wallet on the ground. Then 10 minutes later, the police found me. I'd found another cafe with outdoor service. It wasn't far enough away, and I guess I hadn't hidden my face as well as I thought. I wasn't in a tourist area, and it was pretty easy to identify the only white man around, especially as I was wearing the same clothes. I saw 2 policemen walking towards me and started to run, but this time they were faster. They tackled me to the ground and bundled me into their patrol car. It was dark. Too dark to see anything. At first, I assumed I was on the other side of the world, at night, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was underground. I was in a vast cavern. There was minimal light, coming from a few burning torches in the distance. The ground was rough, but solid, and the air was chilly, but no colder than the average night on the street in most towns. I could make out very little at first, and decided to head toward the torches while I figured out what my new situation was. As I got closer, I realized the torches surrounded a pit, and I could make out people under the torches. Some of them looked up as I approached, but they didn't say anything. All were inside the pit, which I could now see covered a rough square, maybe 30 meters to a side. And then I heard something else. A kind of chittering. To the side, I saw creatures, not human, nor like any animal I've ever seen before. They were about 1 meter tall, and walked on 4 chitinous legs with 2 arms in front of them. Their bodies were black and glossy, and their heads had large jaws and mandibles. In science class, years ago, we had a few stag beetles in a fish tank, and these creatures reminded me of those. The beetles came towards me. There were 6 of them, and while they were smaller than me, they quickly overpowered me. All the while making horrific clicking and chittering sounds, they took me to the edge of the pit. 2 more beetles standing there pushed a long wooden ramp down into the pit, and the others pushed me down it, and then took the ramp back up. I was stuck, or so it seemed. The walls were too high and smooth to easily climb, and I now noticed several more beetles standing guard at intervals along the wall. Even if I got out, I had no idea where I was or what kind of problem I'd found myself in this time. The humans I was with numbered about 50, quite diverse, but young. There were teenagers and people in their 20s, but no older. At 19, I was pretty much in the middle, age-wise. A woman approached me and started speaking French. Great, at least I could understand her. It's impossible to tell time down in that underground cavern, but I gathered it was about the start of their effective nighttime. The woman, who introduced herself as a Parisian named Josie, explained that the beetles use them for labor and other things. Although she refused to elaborate on what other things meant, they kept them fed, made them work for half the day, but otherwise more or less left them alone. Josie introduced me to the others, showed me to the food almost exclusively berries and mushrooms, and told me to fill my belly and rest as well as I could, as I would be put to hard work the next day. She was right. The next day, I was woken by a human, Carl, shaking me. The beetles had already set up the ramp and were bringing us up in groups of 4. I had no intention of being used as a slave, but decided against taking action until I'd figured things out a bit more. My group was led down a maze of tunnels for about 20 minutes until we arrived at a broader cave, though much smaller than the main cavern. One of the beetles held a flat piece of slate on which they had drawn a chalk diagram. They may not be able to speak human languages, but they can hold things with their front limbs and draw. It pointed to each of us in turn, then to a part of the drawing, then to an area of the cave. Jerome, a dark-skinned man from Senegal, explained what I'd already figured out. The beetles wanted us to excavate the cave, according to the plan on the slate. There were some crude pickaxes and other tools already in the cave. I looked at the sharp, heavy tools, and looked at the two small beetles. Jerome mouthed no at me. I learned later that people have tried that before, and they always ended up dead. The creatures were stronger than they looked, so I got to work, pickaxing and chiseling out a room for the insects. After maybe an hour, the beetles left. Sandy, a Canadian girl of 15, told me that while we could speak freely, the tunnels were maze-like. She had run once, but if there was anywhere to go, she hadn't found it. The beetles had left a few torches for us to work by, but they had much better night vision than we did, and while we would get lost in the tunnels, they could seemingly make their way just fine in complete darkness. I think insects lay trails using pheromones as well, so they don't even need to see in the tunnels. And so it continued for a long time. I carved out cave rooms, made what I believe was insect furniture. I still don't know where they got the wood, and even worked a forge. We marked our days by our rest periods, and long ago, somebody had started scratching lines into the wall of the pit to mark each day, as had become tradition. I scratched my name above the day I arrived. This was day 11,408 since the calendar had started, 31 years earlier. We spent our evenings telling stories, true stories of our lives outside, stories we could remember reading and stories we made up ourselves during the long working days. I suggested singing once, but was shot down immediately. Apparently, the beetles really didn't like human song. Just like living on the streets, people come and go. Haruki, a Japanese man of 25, was crushed by a falling rock in an excavation. I wasn't in the same group, but I heard the screams echoing through the corridors. In accordance with our tradition, we scratched his name below the line for that day. Arrivals are marked above, and departures, as we euphemistically call deaths, below the timeline. Jason appeared after a few months, followed shortly by Louise, in much the same way as I had. And then Caroline, a 16-year-old girl from Mexico, lost it when we were being corralled into the pit at the end of the day. Everybody can snap if they're pushed too far, and as she reached the ramp, Caroline screamed and shouted, then ran into the darkness. Some of the insects followed her, and this was when I learned how fast they can move. They caught up with Caroline after only a few seconds and dragged her to the edge of the pit, pinning her down until the rest of us were all in there and they had pulled up the ramp. More beetles had arrived, and then in full view of us all they ripped her apart. Her flesh tore as mandibles slashed into her body. I watched, incapable of help but unable to look away, as she screamed in agony until her windpipe was severed. And then they started to eat her. It took about 10 minutes in all, and at the end of it there was nothing left. No sign that anything had happened, except for the blood that trickled down the wall of the pit. We saw and heard it, all the rending of flesh, the crunching of bone, the chittering of the insects, in what I can only interpret as excitement. When they were finished, the beetles stood on the wall, looked down at us, and walked away like nothing had happened. We were in shock, of course. There were no stories told that evening. In fact, Nobody spoke as Carl scratched CAROLINA below the mark for that day. We went to sleep in silence, though I don't know if any of us actually slept that night. I certainly didn't. The next day continued as normal. We worked in subdued silence. We returned to the pit. We ate our meager meal of berries and fungi. I was the first to speak. My life down there wasn't great, but it was something I could get on with. Something in which I could find a certain level of contentment. Not any longer. So, for the first time, I asked about the doors. Most of my fellows hadn't properly realized that doors were the trigger. It seemed I was the only one who had traveled anywhere else. The underground realm was the first and only trip any of the others had made. Simon, a fellow Englishman, told us that he had once taken some items to the creatures' homes. They lived in carved caves, presumably mined out by previous generations of human captives, and while he didn't understand their culture, they clearly had decorations. While there, he saw a large slate with a chalk face drawn on it. A human face, one that he didn't recognize until Jenny had arrived a few days later. He hadn't mentioned this at the time, but it helped me start to put the pieces together, I think. I don't understand my curse, but I believe the creatures marked me. The other humans in that place hadn't traveled around like I did. Their first trip through a door took them to the underground. I think the woman in the coffee shop recognized that I was marked and tried to help. I think when she touched me, she disrupted the curse, randomizing my destination. And I thought back to the time I tried to help Anissa back in the Kenyan farmhouse, and the look on her face as I portaled away. I wonder what she had seen as I disappeared. This was interesting, but it didn't really help us. Then I talked about my travels, how any door or even window acted as a portal, how I had created my own, and it didn't work until I'd put a door into the doorway. And gradually, we formed a plan. Most of the floor of the pit was made of smooth stone, but there was a small area of earth a couple of meters wide. Our captors rarely came down into the pit. They threw food down from above. We carried waste out in buckets, and they didn't need to come down to bring us up, as they would simply withhold food if we refused, as Jerome recalled from years earlier. It was a simple plan, but a slow one. Over the next few months, we smuggled tiny bits of stone, wood, and whatever else we could hide on our person. First, we built a wooden board, just small enough to cover the soil. One person would dig out soil from below the board, while the rest of us kept watch. The beetles have small eyes, and although their night vision is excellent, they can see very well at a distance, relying more on smell. So, if we were careful, we could work without being noticed. And we were careful. If we were caught at any stage of the plan, it would be game over. We worked for less than an hour each night, covering the hole with the board and hiding the board with soil. Extracted earth went, little by little, into our waste buckets. After some time we hit solid rock, but the hole was now about 1.5 meters deep. It was enough. Phase 2 of the plan was riskier, carving into the solid sections of the wood with sharp rocks made a sound a lot like the beetles' speech. And we knew they had good hearing. We only dared do a tiny bit each night. But eventually we had a frame and a door. All we needed now was a hinge. Slowly, we scraped out 3 holes along one side of the door and tied it to the frame with some braided roots we had gathered from the caves. It was done. I doubted it would hold together for long, but it didn't need to. We held a quiet celebration, as much as we could down there, and Louise carved a final message at the end of the timeline. FUCKYOU. Sandy volunteered to be the first to test it, for all 50 of us to make it. We would need to move fast, and this is why we had decided to use a trapdoor. It would be quicker to jump down, one after another, than to wriggle horizontally through a doorway that size. We checked the surroundings and, seeing only a couple of beetles not paying much attention to us, we decided on our order. I was number 14. Sandy carefully uncovered the trapdoor, opened it, jumped down, and disappeared. It worked. Trying to contain our excitement, we followed through in our agreed order. As number 11 jumped in, I heard chittering from above. They had noticed something, but we could do nothing about that. We kept filing in until I jumped down. This is when I arrived in Western Africa, where I've lived for the last 7 years, and where I hope to live for the rest of my natural life. 13 others had entered the portal before me, but they were nowhere to be seen. I guess I hope that they are living safely elsewhere, away from the clutches of those monstrous slavers. I pray every night that those behind me in the line got away before the creatures reached them, but I haven't heard from them. I'm not sure how I could, unless one of you is reading this. I still don't know how that woman in the coffee shop knew about me. Perhaps she herself had been there, in that cave or another one, and escaped. It would make sense, given the state of her clothes. Or maybe she's something else. A psychic, perhaps. She could walk through doors, and maybe I can now, too. Maybe when I left the underground realm, the curse was broken. But I don't dare risk it. Maybe one day, I'll see somebody else who is marked and recognize them. I could hardly warn them of the danger. Nobody would believe me. But I can touch their skin and disrupt the curse. I've escaped, but the insect things are still there, and who knows how many other colonies they have. It's hard to get exact figures, but in the USA alone, 6,000 people a year go missing and are never found. How many of them are trapped underground, enslaved by a species that regards humans as nothing more than a source of labor and food? Let's move on to the next story. Please don't play the face game. The face game can be played by 4 or more people. Players must begin the game alone and in absolute darkness. If any sources of light or observers are present, the game will fail. But the game itself is simple. Players stand in a circle, with one player in the center. The player in the center is called the judge. The players who form the circle are called the pretenders. In the center of the circle, the judge spins counterclockwise, while the pretenders rotate clockwise around them. The players continue to spin until the judge announces in a loud voice, I wonder, whose face will I find? The pretenders then freeze and take 3 steps backward, widening the circle. The judge can no longer be sure who or what is standing where. They must approach the first pretender and attempt to identify them by touching their face. If the judge touches any part of a pretender apart from their face, or if a pretender moves or speaks, the game fails. A pretender can sneer, scrunch up their nose, or otherwise manipulate their face to make themselves more difficult to identify. When the judge is confident about a pretender's identity, the judge announces loudly, this face belongs to the pretender's full, true name. If the judge is incorrect, the face game ends. Otherwise, the game continues, and the judge approaches the next pretender. If the judge correctly identifies all of the pretenders, the judge wins, and the face game ends. If a pretender successfully deceives the judge, the pretenders win, and the face game ends. There is, however, a third possible outcome. During the face game, it is possible that the judge might touch a face that they are unable to identify, a face that belongs to someone or something that wasn't present when the game began. the outsider. The judge must take their time with the face of the outsider, being sure to touch every part. They must not be discouraged or frightened by weeping sores, strange protrusions, or squirming things beneath the outsider's flesh. Even if the outsider bites the judge, licks them, or makes its skin abrasive, the judge must continue until they have touched every part of the outsider's face. The pretenders must remain in their places. They must not move or speak, regardless of any foul odors, unnatural sounds, or changes in temperature that the outsider might produce. When the judge has completely touched every part of the outsider's face, they must loudly announce, "I do not know who this face belongs to, but surely it is the most beautiful face of all." The outsider then disappears, and the face game ends. However, if the pretenders move or speak, if the judge fails to completely touch the outsider's face or doesn't pronounce the game-ending phrase correctly, or if the outsider successfully impersonates one of the pretenders, the outsider wins the face game. And what happens if the outsider wins the face game? My best friends and I found out on Halloween night, 1999, light as a feather, stiff as a board, light as a feather. Stiff as a board, the five of us chanted, but Amy didn't budge. My fingers hurt. I was starting to sweat in Claire's stuffy, unfinished basement, and I thought that choosing our heaviest friend for the witchy ritual might not have been the best idea. I wanted, desperately, for it to work. I think we all did. Mostly because now that we were 12, Halloween had started to seem sort of lame. Erica had stolen her brother's copy of Scream, but it hadn't made us jump and shriek the way we used to. Eating so much candy had made us all feel sick to our stomachs, and the flickering tea candles Christina had set up felt cliche instead of spooky. We all wanted that special Halloween magic back, even if it was just for one more night. The basement door opened with a creak. We all jumped and let Amy drop. "Ow!" Amy groaned, clutching her head. Claire's older sister, Holly, stood backlit by the rectangle of light at the top of the basement stairs. "Are you still trying to do that stupid trick?" Holly sneered. "You know it's fake, right?" Holly was 2 years older than us, and according to herself about 10 times cooler. Maybe it was just the sweltering basement, or my frustration with our disappointing Halloween night, but I suddenly just couldn't take any more of Holly's superiority complex. "Oh, let me guess," I snapped. "I bet you know one that really works, right?" How I wish I could take those words back now. Holly's mouth opened and closed soundlessly a few times. She couldn't believe that one of her little sister's friends had actually talked back to her. "I do," Holly spat, when her jaw finally started working again, "and I'll prove it." She slammed the basement door on her way out, and we could hear Clara's parents haranguing her upstairs. We all looked at each other and giggled. Holly was gone a long time. Here. "The face game," read the header. "This isn't some game you knew about," I snorted. "You just printed it off from somewhere. Look, the ink's not even dry. You're just too scared to play it. Anyway, I'm going to talk to my boyfriend, so do not come upstairs," Holly shouted over her shoulder, before slamming the door and getting yelled at once again. We read through the instructions several times. It didn't seem complicated, but even as a preteen, I wondered about the face game. It seemed so simple, so anonymous. Who had created the face game? Why? At the time, I didn't have any answers. The 5 of us stood in a circle, waiting for Claire's parents to click off the television and go to bed. When the house was finally quiet, we began. I volunteered to be the judge. It had looked easy on paper, but spinning in circles in Clara's stuffy, pitch-black basement went to my head immediately. I had barely twirled 5 times when the floor began to feel wobbly beneath my feet. I wonder whose face will I find? I shouted queasily, starting the game. It had sounded like there were a lot more than just my friend's footsteps circling around me in the dark. But when I spoke, all sounds stopped. Standing dizzily in the complete darkness made me feel like an astronaut from one of the documentaries we watched in school, floating alone in the lightless, hostile void of space. With a shiver, I took a step forward, then another. Where were my friends? I held my out in front of me and staggered blindly forward. When my fingers touched flesh, I nearly shrieked. A face. Fortunately, the first one was easy. It was a round face with soft, pudgy features, and if that weren't enough, there wasn't a drip of sweat on it. That meant it could only belong to Amy, the girl we'd been trying to lift with our spell. I felt around her face, just to be sure, then called out, "This face belongs to Amy Lehan McCade." I heard Amy let out a sigh of relief. No one else spoke. The game would go on. The next face was bony and twitchy. Whoever it was didn't want to make it easy for me. They wrinkled their nose and lips so much that for a terrifying moment I thought that I was touching the outsider described in the rules. But then I realized that whatever I was touching trimmed its eyebrows and used strawberry shampoo. Only one person I knew was such a pain. "This face belongs to Clara Simmons." "Wrong," Christina laughed. Sudden footsteps, a banged knee, cursing. Kelsey flipped the lights back on. I was standing in front of Christina. Clara was after her the circle. The darkness had made me more sensitive to smell, I supposed. And besides, I'd figured that only Clara would try to trip me up. I'd forgotten how sneaky Christina could be. My friends, the pretenders, had won the face game. I felt my cheeks burning. Holly's stupid paper printout game had been more difficult than I thought, and I looked and felt like an idiot. I was angry with them, but even more angry with myself. "Well, since you won, Christina, why don't you be judged next?" I challenged her. Christina just shrugged. I realized that none of the others understand what I was so angry about. They didn't understand the tension and fear that came with being the judge, that weird sensation of touching a suddenly unfamiliar face in the dark. Before I knew it, the lights clicked off and we began to spin. I don't know if Christina had a higher tolerance for dizziness, or if she just wanted to show off, but she twirled for what felt like forever. Candy sloshed sickeningly in my stomach, and I wondered what would happen if someone passed out during the face game. I wonder, whose face will I find? Christina sighed in a sing-song voice. We froze. After taking 3 steps back, that feeling was back. The sensation of being alone in the universe. There was nothing to do but wait for hands to touch my face. I heard shuffling feet, wiggling, a barely stifled giggle. "This face belongs to Clara Simmons." Clara groaned. Christina moved on. She barely took 2 minutes to identify the next pretender. "This face belongs to Erica Rebecca Moss." Christina was moving fast, maybe too fast. I heard her uncertain footsteps as she nearly walked outside the circle and had to double back, feeling her way through the dark just as I had. Suddenly, Christina gasped. Then, silence. What was taking her so long? And when had Claire's basement gotten so cold? I shivered. If it weren't for the total darkness, I was sure I would have been able to see my breath. A foul smell like rotten eggs invaded my nostrils. Something was wrong. I desperately wanted to ask Christina what was going on, and yet, if a pretender moves or speaks, The outsider wins the face game. I heard a sick gurgling noise, followed by another more recognizable sound, Christina weeping. "I do not know whose face this is," Christina sobbed, "but surely it is the most beau ARGH. I couldn't take any more. I didn't care what happened after the game ended. It just had to stop. I stumbled forward into the pitch blackness, feeling for the light switch. I should have slipped on beanbags and candy wrappers or slammed into the basement furniture. I should have found the stairs. But the darkness seemed to go on forever. Christina, I asked nervously. No response. It was like my words had been swallowed up. I wrapped my arms around myself against the chill, but it was useless. The cold penetrated all the way to the bone. When I held my jaw to stop my teeth from chattering, I thought for sure I could hear someone screaming, but it felt very far away. No matter how far I walked forward or backwards, I couldn't reach the basement wall. I knelt down and touched the floor. Instead of Clara's carpet, I touched something as cold and smooth as ice. Is anyone there?" I cried. From somewhere behind me, I heard a low rumbling sound that might have been laughter. The next thing I knew, I was blind. "Ugh!" A dark figure surrounded by light shouted down at me. "What are you twerps doing down here? Mom and Dad are pissed." I knew that voice. Clara's older sister Holly, at the top of the stairs once more. My friends were scattered around the basement, like broken toys, terrified and exhausted, all except Christina. Christina stood in the center of the room, her face expressionless. She opened and closed her fingers and toes as if using them for the first time. She wriggled the muscles in her face, as though trying to understand how to move them. And then she smiled. "Your stupid game didn't work," Christina yelled up the stairs. The rest of us looked at each other. It had worked too well. Christina had touched the outsider. She should know that better than anyone, and yet... Of course, it didn't work. Holly rolled her eyes. "I just printed it out from some message board so you losers wouldn't bother me while I talked to Brandon. He doesn't even like you," Christina said flatly. "What?" Holly's eyes grew wide. "Why don't you ask Brandon what he did with Shelley Spicer from second period at Alex Hoffeld's homecoming party?" Christina sneered. "How do you know about that?" Holly stammered. "Anyway, Brandon didn't even go. He told me so." That wasn't what he told Shelley. "Ask him. You'll see." Without another word, Holly slammed the door. We all stared. "What?" Christina shrugged, examining her fingernails. "Holly Simmons is a bitch. She deserved it." "Chris, what happened to you?" I asked. "Puff," Christina snorted. "Don't tell me you're still talking about that stupid game. Just before everything got weird, you found the outsider, didn't you? I heard you, but surely it is the most beautiful face of a... Don't tell me you actually fell for that." Christina threw her head back and laughed. "I was just messing with you. You're still such a baby. I mean, none of the rest of you were scared, right?" Christina looked from face to face. One by one, each of my friends shook their heads. I couldn't believe it. I'd seen how bewildered and frightened they were when the face game finally ended. I knew that. Like me, they'd been shivering and lost, trapped in that cold, dark other place. I felt betrayed, but I couldn't blame them. There was a menacing new look in Christina's glare, as though something ancient and cruel was staring out from behind her eyes. I think, on a deeper level, I already knew the truth. The real Christina was gone forever, trapped in that freezing abyss and maybe even destined to become an outsider herself. The thing that had come back inside her shell was something else entirely. An outsider, and it had no problem turning my friends against me. We were young, impressionable, and to be honest, afraid of what Christina had become. Throughout the fall and into the winter, Christina followed me. In the whirl of corner leaves, as the yellow school bus rounded the corner, just outside my bathroom stall at school. Standing in the new fallen snow outside my bedroom window. She never spoke, but the message was clear. Never speak of what you know. Once she was confident of my silence, Christina, or the thing inside her, got to work on its favorite pastime, destroying the lives of the people around her. Her parents divorced, citing irreconcilable differences. But I knew the real reason. They wanted to escape from their daughter. They wanted to escape from the outsider. In time, Christina's sadistic games drove Kelsey and Erica away. They became her new targets, and the way she teased them throughout high school crossed the line from bullying to torture more than once. Those who stayed close to her weren't so lucky. She got Clara hooked on heroin our junior year, and Amy was killed in a car crash when Christina blackmailed her into driving drunk on prom night. Sometimes it was over quickly. Sometimes it dragged on for years. But Christina always wrung every drop of suffering she could from the people around her before throwing them away. To her, or its suffering seemed to be a sort of game. I usually kept my distance from hometown gossip, but in Christina's case, it was like being the spectator to a horrific natural disaster. I just couldn't look away. In dive bars and beauty salons, I learned of the careers she'd left in ruins, the relationships she'd wrecked, the pain and death that followed her like a black cloud. Eventually, she wound up in prison, given her love of cruel games, manipulation, and control ensure she enjoyed every minute of it. I ran into one of the correctional officers who worked in her unit by chance a few years later. His name was Mark. He'd gone to high school with Christina and I, and, like me, he was now terrified of her.
I noticed a cast on his left arm.
She basically rules the cell block. The inmates are all afraid of her, and so are the guards. You should hear the stories that the cops tell, the ones who arrested her in the first place. They said she was crawling up the walls like a goddamn spider, and that's not the worst of it. We were standing in the aisle of a busy supermarket, but I suddenly felt cold and alone, like I had when we played the face game. Mark looked over his shoulder before continuing. The worst part is how she manipulates people. Know what I mean? I did. I thought of Erica, with her head in a high school toilet. Claire, with a needle in her arm. Amy's arm hanging out the door of a car wrapped around a tree. The other day, we caught her in an empty storage room with some other inmates. All the lights were off, and they were playing some sort of game. I shivered. Mark went on. We put her into solitary confinement after that, and solitary breaks everybody. I've seen the toughest gangsters and most psychotic killers cry like babies after just a few days of solitary, but not her, not Christina. We could see her on the camera, just staring into space. Mark trailed off. He cleared his throat. Sorry if I seem a little freaked out by this. It's just, I was one of the co's who interrupted whatever game they were playing. And when the lights flickered on, I'd swear I saw something dark and horrible standing in the circle with the rest of them. It disappeared right away. And then, well, then I tried to put cuffs on Christina, and she snapped my wrist like a goddamn twig. He gestured to his arm. Look, don't tell many people in town about this, okay? I don't need everybody thinking I'm scared of a girl from high school. But he was scared. We both were, especially after I told him my side of the story. Mark believed me, and we kept tabs on Christina as best we could. But after she got out of prison, the trail went cold. It's only been a few weeks now, but I've noticed a disturbing trend. More and more people seem to be talking about the face game. When my friends and I played the face game, it was just some anonymous printout from an online chat room. Now, it seemed to be showing up everywhere, in viral videos, in the conversations of kids walking home from school. Mark even found the rules of the face game stapled to a telephone pole near his house. It can only mean one thing. The outsider wearing Christina's skin is spreading the word about the face game. Is it trying to bring more of its kind to our world? Or find its way back where it came from? I don't have any answers. But when I walk through the streets of my old hometown, looking at the happy expressions of families out for an autumn evening stroll, I hear a sing-song voice repeating in my mind, I wonder whose face will I find. Let's move on to the next story. She will come to me, blanketed in the stars. I can't tell you how many times I have heard those words over the last decade. My father, Raymond Chandler, suffered a massive stroke and couldn't say anything else afterward. Just those 9 words over and over. Well, I guess that isn't entirely true. He said something else at the end, but I'll get to that later. I don't want to dredge up all of my memories of his recovery process, but I'll say this. It was rough. Most of his physicians believed he would stay in a catatonic state for the rest of his life. Regaining his ability to move independently seemed unlikely, even if he did wake. Speech, that would be gone too, according to the same doctors. Day after day, I would sit at his bedside and read to him. Thriller and detective novels, mostly. He was always so busy with work or taking care of me that he didn't have much time to read. That didn't stop him from picking up a hardback book and adding it to his never-ending retirement reading pile. I would pull a book from the pile every few days and read it to him. Some of the nurses said they thought he would hear it. An anchor, some of them called it. I don't know if I really believe it worked, but it helped fill the crippling silence of his sterile hospital room. After finishing up our 5th or 6th detective noir, I closed the book and sat it on the table beside him. Looking at him, I saw his chest rising and falling shallowly. His color was pale and his weight was dropping. With tears in my eyes, I took his frail hand in mine and gave it a squeeze. "Gotta head home, Dad," I whispered. "I love you." As I began to place his hand back on the white blanket, I felt his muscle tighten around my hand. He squeezed my hand back firmly. Both of his eyes opened lazily and gazed into mine. A croaking noise erupted from his throat. He was trying to talk, but his mouth was too dry. In a panic, I fumbled to the bedside table and poured him a cup of water. Holding it to his mouth, he took small sips and smacked the roof of his mouth with his tongue. A wet cough exploded, and I used a Kleenex to wipe spittle away from the corners of his mouth. "She will come to me, blanketed in the stars," he said weakly. I punched the call button beside his bed to alert the nurse. "What?" I said, my heart thundering in my chest. "I couldn't understand you, Dad." He gripped my hand even more tightly and pulled me toward him.
I leaned in closely, placing my ear to his mouth.
Hot breath and wheezing filled my ear. "She will come to me, blanketed in the stars," he said firmly. As he spoke the words, the bright, fluorescent lights above the bed sizzled and burned away. After Dad got out of the hospital, I became his full-time caretaker. I had worked as a home healthcare nurse for a number of years, so the transition was pretty natural. His recovery, for the most part, had been incredible. All of his range of motion returned. He could walk on his own. His vision was as good as it had been before the stroke. Basic tasks like tying his shoes and getting dressed presented no issues. The only lasting effects were reduced hemiparesis, or weakness, on his right side, and his inability to communicate anything other than those 9 words. She will come to me, blanketed in the stars. His doctors said was unusual, but not unheard of. How a stroke damages the brain is different for each person. The ability to form and speak full thoughts may return. It could be weeks or years, the doctor told us, or it may never improve. It never did. My father could only rattle off that single phrase. He would say it with different voice inflections to express his mood. I didn't always understand what he wanted, but I knew if he was happy or sad. It could be incredibly frustrating, but I did my best to remain patient and understanding. For a brief time, we thought he may be able to write to communicate his thoughts, but it proved fruitless. Any time you gave him a dry erase board or a pad of paper, he wrote those same 9 words over again. She will come to me, blanketed in the stars. Our day-to-day life was mostly normal after returning home, with one exception. Dad started using chalk to draw enormous star maps on every inch of the walls. The massive designs eventually covered every available inch empty space. As he ran out of space to expand his comprehensive work, he would remove framed photos and paintings from the wall and stack them in the center of the room. When he first started, I was confused and concerned about the activity. When I saw he was drawing star maps, I don't mean he would work in one area of the house until he completed a portion. He would stare at the wall for a half hour before placing a single dot. As soon as he had finished, he would walk to another room and repeat the process. After the wall was sufficiently covered in the small white markings, I waited until he went to bed one evening and decided to clean the walls. I filled a bucket full of warm water and used a soft sponge to remove the markings. It took me hours to wash them away and return the photos and paintings to their original positions. The next morning when Dad saw them, he was furious. She will come to me, he shouted as he stomped around the living room, gesturing toward the clean walls. Blanketed in the stars. Dad, I pleaded. They were just little chalk dots. Let's go in the kitchen and have some breakfast, huh? He stormed back to this bedroom and slammed the door. I could hear him crying as I knocked, but he didn't answer. He didn't come out for the rest of the day, as I recall. Just sat in his room whimpering and muttering those same 9 maddening words. As a peace offering, I drove to the store that evening while he slept and purchased him a box of chalk. It hadn't occurred to me that although his artwork on the walls didn't make sense to me, it could be very meaningful to him. It did the trick. The next morning, when he came out of his room, I handed him the box of chalk. I'm sorry, I said sincerely. It's your house. If you want to draw on the walls, then that's okay. He looked down at the box in his hand and smiled. She will come to me, blanketed in the stars, he said questioningly. Sure, Dad, I responded, blanketed in the stars. Over the next few years, Dad filled the walls with enormous star maps. His pace had quickened, and soon the charts bent around the corner of doors and continued into the adjacent room. Some days he would pull huge books from his office and show me photographs of the constellations and formations as he repeated those echoing words. I knew in his mind he was explaining to me in great detail which celestial bodies they represented, and I would nod along. He looked so happy, content even. But all I heard were those words. She will come to me, blanketed in the stars. 8 years after the stroke and Dad's health was starting to take a turn. He had a more difficult time getting out of bed.
Standing for a long period of time was out of the question.
His memory seemed to be slipping a bit. Still, He added to his star charts and maps. That was also when the light bulbs started to burn out rapidly. Just one at first, the hallway light. I would put a fresh bulb in, and within 2 or 3 days, the filament inside would be no more than 2 charred prongs. Soon after, the light bulbs began burning out throughout the house frequently. My weekly grocery trip always included a few packs of incandescents. I told myself the old-style bulbs may be the problem, and we switched to LEDs, but it only lasted a day or 2 longer. In frustration, I had an electrician come to the house and check the wiring multiple times. They never found any issues. Everything worked just like it should, but the bulbs continued to burn out. With Dad's mobility dropping off, we started spending more time at the house, where we used to take daily walks or travel to the planetarium. He would spend most of the day reading a book quietly in his armchair. His work on the stars grew less and less. Me, I'd spend my day in front of the television. While I was a great student, I never developed the same love for reading that my parents did. Television broke up the monotony of the quiet house. Most nights, I would fall asleep in front of the television. Sometimes, I would wake up to see the glow of the TV hitting the tiny chalk dots on the wall. It almost made the little spots sparkle like the night sky, as though my father's artwork had come to life and embodied the very celestial landscape that danced above us. It was in the cascade of light from the television that I first started to see the sinister shapes. I knew it must have been my imagination, but thin lines seemed to grow between some of the stars, forming ghastly figures. Sleek, hunched, and snarling creatures made of tiny chalk dots seemed to prowl on the illuminated walls. The sounds of crackling plaster and groaning wood filled my ears. A chill would build at the base of my spine, as crawled up to my neck as though I were an unwitting prey animal in the sights of an apex predator. When I would turn the lamp on beside me, the half-dreamed figures would vanish. Nothing left but the white field of stars. I think my father felt it too. On those nights, I would hear him call out in panic. When I would enter the room, he would be pointing madly from wall to wall and screaming those same 9 words. She will come to me, blanketed in the stars. When he got like that, I would have to sit beside his bed until he fell asleep again. The bedside lamp would always have a burnt-out bulb, so I would change it. He would hold my hand as he drifted off. It felt so much like when I was a child, when I would cry over how much I missed my mother. Dad would hold my hand in the dim lamplight then, and whisper to me about how Mom was so happy among the stars. On the morning of my father's final day, I think I knew it was near the end. Most of his days, he seemed to be filled with fear. He rarely slept unless I sat beside him, hand in hand. If I didn't sleep in the chair next to him, I almost always found him on the floor the next morning. He would be clutching a dwindling piece of chalk, crumpled on the floor next to the wall. For the past few weeks, he had been scrawling away at an ornate rectangle. It was beautiful and haunting all at once, like the recording of a lost loved one's voice. It looked almost like a door, though it was nearly 9 feet tall. Delicate swirls filled the space between the thick white border. Lighter shades of gray covered the inside, carefully smudged inch by inch by my father's shaking hand. He never worked on this during the day. Only during the night, and only when I wasn't in the room. I had purchased a baby monitor for his room for the nights, when I was able to sleep in my own bed. The first few times I saw him wobble across the floor to work on the door, I had run to the room and tried to put him back to bed, but he would become so agitated that I thought we would come to blows. No matter how many times I carried him back to bed, I'd see him again on the screen working away at the door. The rest of his room was covered in more unsettling work. What had once been a field of white chalk stars now had faint lines connecting them. They came together to form the horrific creatures I always dreamt of when I sat in front of the television. I never saw my father draw them, but they changed frequently. That morning, when I entered my father's room, he was sitting in his armchair. His head was tipped back and his robe dropped open sloppily. When I first saw him, I thought he had passed away in the night. My heart ached for a moment until I saw him stir. "She will come to me," he said groggily, "blanketed in the stars." "Good morning, Dad," I said. "Breakfast is ready." We ate together in the kitchen. Well, I ate. Dad picked at his breakfast and shoveled a few mouthfuls of eggs. He hadn't been eating much and was beginning to look sickly thin. His doctor offered IV nutrition regimens, and I was sure that would be the next step. Usually, we would sit on the porch after breakfast, but he got up from the table and walked on shaking legs back to his bedroom and crawled beneath the coverers. For a few moments, I considered trying to stir him, to take him outside for some sunlight, but he seemed so frail. I decided to let him rest. Sometime in the afternoon, I must have drifted off. When I woke up, I could see the streetlights flowing in through the windows. Pulling the cord on the lamp beside me, I wasn't surprised to find the bulb was burnt out. Walking groggily to the wall, I flipped the light switch to discover it was also burnt out. I was heading toward the cupboard in the kitchen for some fresh bulbs when I heard my father scream. Rushing to his bedroom, I twisted the knob to find it locked. I began to hammer my hand on the door, calling my father's name, but he didn't answer. My ears were filled with his panic screams, and the sound of things falling heavily to the floor. "Dad," I shouted. "Dad, unlock the door. You've got to let me in." More screaming and the sound of heavy footsteps. I threw my weight against the door, but the thick wood didn't budge. The hinges would rattle slightly, but the door never gave way. Still, the sounds of terror inside persisted. My phone was still beside the recliner in the living room, so I ran back in to grab it and call 911. As I reached to pick it up, I looked at the screen of the baby monitor, and my heart nearly stopped. My father sat in his bed, blankets pulled up to his chin, shivering violently. His eyes darted side to side at the walls. Glowing orbs that had once been chalk stars danced along the walls, which bulged and rippled. Something behind the walls was pushing against them and trying to break through. Abandoning my phone, I ran to the garage and tumbled down the steps, landing hard on the concrete floor. My head was swimming, but I managed to push myself back onto my feet. Darting toward the tool bench, I found my father's old hatchet and ran back to his bedroom door. Blow after blow with the hatchet rained down from above my head. Flecks of paint and chunks of wood peppered my face as I carved away at the door. Inside, I could still hear my father screaming, but now it was mingled with a guttural rumbling that filled my heart with dread. After a few moments, I was able to make a hole large enough to put my hand through. Shoving my hand inside, I swatted blindly for the door latch. The rumbling had swollen into deafening roars, completely covering my father's screams of horror. My hand found the lock and twisted it, allowing the door to swing in. I could see my father reaching toward me, eyes filled with terror. He was screaming something, but I couldn't hear him against the cracking of plaster and splintering of wooden beams. I didn't need to hear him know what he was saying. "She will come to me, blanketed in the stars." Dozens of dull lights pushed themselves out of the wall and tumbled onto the floor. They rolled like bowling balls before coming to a stop. The strained sound from the walls fell silent as the orbs of light began to shake. Slowly, they began to move toward each other before forming an enormous sphere. My father and I stared in awe for a moment at the ball of light in front of us. I was about to call for Dad to come with me when the ball cracked like an egg, falling to pieces on the floor. Standing in its place was something unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was a creature made of small stars. Delicate lines danced between each of the illuminated dots, forming a nightmarish beast. Heavy claws sank into the floor as the celestial beast turned toward me. Two red orbs in the sea of white met with my eyes before the thing erupted in another guttural roar. I raised the hatchet above my head, but a cluster of brilliant white balls swung toward me and connected with my head. The hatchet dropped from my hand as I went sailing through the air, crashing against the wall by the ornate door my father had drawn. The air ejected from my lungs, leaving me struggling to draw breath. The thing turned back toward my father and lowered its stance as it began to move forward. My father screamed and thrashed in the bed as the celestial demon crept closer. It seemed to be preparing to lunge for him when suddenly the room was filled with intense light. I looked to my side and saw brilliant beams pouring from the outline of the door. The light danced and erupted throughout the delicate latticework my father had drawn. All around us, the air was filled with a sensation of serenity. Even the beast turned to look. The ornate door on the wall pushed open, flooding the room with overwhelming warmth and light. I wanted to cover my eyes, but the sight was too beautiful and I couldn't turn away. On the floor at the foot of my father's bed, the celestial abomination began to roar and writhe in pain. I looked away from the opening to see the creature melting into a pool of illumination. The waves of warmth and light from the door had driven it back to wherever it had come from, leaving the room in silence. I turned to look at the door again. A woman walked out and into the bedroom. She was so tall, nearly 8 feet. Her body was slender and agile, her smile beautiful and serene. Draped over her shoulders and falling to the floor was a silver shawl. Lights danced and sparkled over every inch, shining like stars in the night sky. Blanketed in the stars. Leaning down toward me, she placed her hand on my chest, and my struggling lungs filled with air. Every ache and pain in my body faded. I felt no more fear, only love, only peace. She smiled at me and began to walk toward my father's bed. I looked toward him. He had thrown the blanket to the side and was smiling at the beautiful woman. He lifted a shaking hand toward her, and she lifted hers in return. "She has come for me," he said. "She is blanketed in the stars." The woman took my father's hand. "I've missed you, Raymond. I do believe it is time to go." "Claire," he cooed, "I knew you would come. You're as beautiful as you were in my dreams." My mother and father walked hand in hand toward the door, stopping for only a moment before me. He smiled at me as a single tear rolled down his cheek. My mother bent over and caressed my face. I put my hand over hers for just a moment as she kissed the top of my head. They passed through the door and it sealed shut behind them. I don't know where they went, but that's okay. Wherever they are together, blanketed in the stars.